Last time in class, we finished off with the humanistic perspective. And so then the next perspective that I want to tell you about is the trait perspective. What does it mean to have traits? What is a trait? It's a characteristic, yeah. And when we think of traits in psychology, we generally think of relatively stable characteristics that don't change that much through time. The other perspective than the trait perspective is the state perspective, the idea that that your behavior is momentary and it can change from time to time to time. So we might study, for example, people's trait characteristics, but we might also be interested in studying how their behavior is affected by the situation or the state that they're in, right? And so the trait perspective really comes out of the 1940s, 1950s, really searching for an alternative to the psychodynamic model or the psychodynamic perspective, and trying to find out if we can measure scientifically the degree to which people are more or less a particular way. Their characteristics are more or less similar or different. And so what you have to do if you're going to do that is develop what are called factors. And a factor really is just a measurement. And one of the factors that, one of the original factors for personality was Eysenk's introversion and extroversion. And so Eysenck developed a measurement that would tell us to what degree someone was more introverted, that is, introverted, more withdrawn, more reserved maybe, and the degree to which someone was extroverted, very outgoing, easily able to kind of mix in parties and that kind of thing. And so then the question was, well, can we predict certain kinds of behavioral characteristics? Yes. If I know how introverted someone is, I can predict to a reasonable amount of certainty how they're going to behave in any given situation. So all things being equal, someone who's more introverted in one situation is going to behave more reserved and more withdrawn than someone who's extroverted in that situation. Yep.
When people talk about a type A or type B personality, are they talking anything about these two factors?
Nope. The question is about type A and type B personality. Type A and type B personality is a constellation of behavioral characteristics that's used to describe someone who is more prone to heart attack and heart disease. So basically it comes out of epidemiological research on heart disease, and people who have this constellation of characteristics, the type A personality, tends to have more heart disease than the type B personality. It's a different, it's not really a personality. It's not considered part of the personality measurement perspective that psychologists generally use because it's got so many factors in it. It's not very useful to lump all that stuff together and say type A. You can't predict their behavior that well, but you can predict the likelihood that they'll have heart problems. Yeah. So this is one factor, introversion, extroversion. Eysenck then added a second factor which helped predict behavior more. Stability and instability. And so what he came up with was a way to, based on where you scored on each of these factors, it would kind of put you somewhere in this dimensional space. So if you scored highly on stability and highly on extroversion, you might be very sort of outgoing, very jovial, very friendly. You wouldn't be subject to, big changes in mood or behavior, right? Very, rock solid, generally somebody that people would like. On the other hand, if you score over here, high on introversion, high on instability, then you're, I guess, like Ted Kaczynski, I don't know, so, holed up in a cabin somewhere, sending bombs to people at universities. So, this kind of these two factors help to kind of predict behavior, but there was still a lot of variance. The same person who measured this much and this much on introversion and stability, or extroversion and stability, this person's behavior might be very different than that person's behavior. And so what that means is there's variance. And the goal, whenever you're trying to develop measurements in psychology, is to reduce the variance. Because the more variance that you explain by one of these factors, the more likely you're going to be able to accurately predict behavior. Yeah.
What if you were right in the middle?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, somewhere down in here. I don't know. Yeah, you'd be okay. Yeah. So Cattell then worked off of Eysenk's model, and he developed an additional 14 factors. So he wound up with, he started out with like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He just like ballooned into this huge 16-factor model, which is really hard to conceptualize, first of all, in your head, but it's also really difficult to deal with in terms of giving someone, a test that can measure their personality. Because there's so many items, so many factors, that it becomes really, really onerous. And what happens is through some statistical methodology, these 16 factors wind up being whittled down into what are called the big 5 factors, or the 5-factor model. And these 5 factors, it turns out, predict behavior almost as well as the 16 and better than the 2-factor model. So, questions on this stuff? So here's the 5 factors. One factor is called openness. Now, openness does not refer to the degree to which someone is self-disclosing, right? It's not like, how open are they to telling you their secrets. It's actually openness to new experience. So are you the kind of person, for example, who likes to eat weird foods or at ethnic restaurants? Are you the kind of person who likes to eat the same thing, relatively the same things over and over? It's almost like adventurousness. So you're willing to try new things and new experiences. The second factor in the big 5 is conscientiousness. And this has to do with the degree to which that you tend to be organized, neat, predictable in some ways, right? So if you're high on conscientiousness, you're very organized. If you're low on conscientiousness, you're going to be very disorganized, very messy. And the third factor is one of Eysenk's original factors, extroversion. We talked about that. Fourth factor is agreeableness. And agreeableness basically has to do with how likable are you to other people? How friendly are you in situations? How easy is it to get along with you? Do you put do you put barriers in the way for people to get along with you? Some people do that. You try to get to know them and they're like, they don't want any part of you, right? And then the fifth factor is called neuroticism in your book, I think. It's now been changed to emotional stability. And the reason that they changed it, well, let me tell you what neuroticism is. Neuroticism is basically how likely you are to respond to people or things in your environment in very neurotic ways, with anxiety, with suspicion, with emotional lability, it's called. Your emotions kind of go up and down. They don't stay real stable. Versus emotional stability, which is someone who, maintains a relatively level head all the time and isn't subject to these changes in mood. And generally, people with emotional stability are easier to get along with as a result. So it's conceptually connected to agreeableness. So I liked neuroticism because it made a nice acronym, right? OCEAN. That's how I remember it. So now it's OCEAES. OCEAS. So that's not so great. Anyway, they changed this because all of these are valenced. There's a word called valence. Valence in psychology means how, in this case, how sort of good or bad they are, how positive or negative. And these are all positively valenced characteristics, whereas this one wound up being the only negatively valenced characteristic, so it was modified to bring it back into valence with the others. Now, I keep forgetting to produce a Big Five test for all of you. I'll try to do that and bring it in next time. Questions on the Big Five stuff? Would what? Being forgiving probably would fall somewhere into agreeableness, maybe. I don't know. Someone we might be able making a drug deal, or maybe you got a bet on the Cleveland game today. So we might be able to look at people who are generally forgiving and see where they score on these Big Five. And then we would be able to, if we measured someone else in the future, based on their Big Five scores, we might be able to say that they were likely to be forgiving. Yeah.
I was 12 when my little sister was born. She's 11 now. And when she was a baby, I swear for the first 2 years of her life, she did nothing but scream and cry and just, she was the worst kid in the world. She's got to be possessed by the devil. And I always wondered if kids like that, grow out of those stages. And in some ways she has, and in others she hasn't. And of course my mom and my dad, they say I'm jealous. I'm not jealous of her. Her personality is so skewed from mine.
Yep. Yep.
She's so emotionally stable and set in her ways. But she's really that spoiled little kid still. I was just wondering if that's my perspective or.
Right. So her behavior, you're talking about your sister's behavior, who's younger than you. Her behavior in that way is generally referred to as temperament. When we talk about children's behavior, we talk about temperament. And there is some relationship between temperament as a child and behavior as an adult, but I don't know what the relationship is. I think your book will talk about it, or maybe did talk about it in the development chapter. You might go back and review the development chapter on temperament and see what the research says about temperament as a child versus as an adult. I just don't know what it is. Yep.
To be a nice child, nice baby, you expect them to grow up and be a nice person.
Good.
I'm inclined to think it's not necessarily true, though. 'Cause
Good.
I mean, that's kind of
Uh-huh.
well, I mean, I was nice to people, but I was really like in your face and like did whatever I wanted to do. And you know, my parents were fine with it because they kind of like sensed that I just needed to just do it, and I grew out of it.
Yep.
But other parents were like, "Oh my God, your daughter is uncontrollable," and then now they're like, "Oh, it was just yesterday," and I'm like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah, so you've changed a lot over the course of the years. And so that kind of brings up the question that one of the controversies we talked about earlier in the chapter was the idea of stability versus change. You know, how much is our personality, how much does it change over our lifetime, and how stable is it over our lifetime? Now, we don't generally measure this stuff in children, and I think that's because their personality development is so incomplete. And remember, back to the development chapter, and for example, Erickson's stages of development. And you know, you go through a lot of changes and a lot of transitions from the time when you are young to when you're really into your adolescence or later. There's huge changes, for example, during adolescence in your personality. So my suspicion is that it would be hard to predict from childhood to adulthood, but I'm not sure what the data are. Yeah, Christopher, do you have a question?
That you already answered it. I
Okay.
was going to ask about how the different phases of development change of personality.
Yeah, and don't forget, for example, with children, up until they're about 3 or 4 approximately, they have these very, they view the world very egocentrically. And until they develop, for example, theory of mind, they think everybody else in their environment sees the world exactly as they do. And so that's going to change, that's going to have an effect on personality too, of course, yeah. Yeah, good question. Okay, so far we've been talking about the idea that we have these relatively stable characteristics that can help predict our behavior in situations. And so then that brings up the issue of the thing is that we have personality, but it doesn't fully explain the variance in behavior across situations. Because you have a relatively stable personality, but in the classroom, your behavior is quite different than your behavior at a kegger party, right? What do you kids say these days? What do you call a kegger party these days? A rager, okay. When you're hanging out at a rager, you're not the same person almost as you are in here. You know, partly maybe due to the alcohol consumption, but and the alcohol disinhibition effects, right? But to a large degree, you behave very differently. So then this brings up the issue of the relative influence of situation and disposition. And so that's the root of what's called the social cognitive perspective in psychology. And the social cognitive perspective recognizes that, yes, we do have individual differences. And individual differences is almost like a code word for personality. You are each individually different because of your personalities. But the situation has an effect on how you behave or how you respond to any given stimulus. So then what comes out of that is the idea that it's not a simple relationship. It's not that the personality determines behavior or the situation determines behavior, but rather a particular personality in a particular situation is going to behave differently than another personality in that situation, or vice versa. If you're in different situations, you're going to behave differently. So there's an interactive effect. They interact together to result in complex behaviors. And so, so when we think about behavior, we think about the self, and we've been talking about personality in terms of the self, identity, who you are, what your self-concept is and what your conception of other people is. The self, and then the situation. So depending on what kind of situation you're in, you may need to use different kinds of behaviors, or you may just engage in different kinds of behaviors. But oftentimes the situation demands particular kinds of behaviors from people too. And we'll get into talking about the fundamental attribution error, which is that most people think of others, the behavior of others, as due to their dispositions, when in reality the behavior of others is more often due to situations. So the self, the situation, and then the third factor that's going to come to play in the social cognitive perspective is culture. And so we see these very significant differences in behavior across cultures. Here's just one example. If I were to show you an aquarium picture, maybe a recording of an aquarium scene, and you would see a bunch of fish and plants, but there is generally one larger, faster moving fish in the scene. And so I ask you, what did you notice in the aquarium scene? And for the most part, people in North America, you all, would probably say, I saw the big fish. We take that same experiment over to Japan, and we run the same experiment. We say, what did you see? And it's more likely that they'll describe things in the relationship of objects in the background, or the relationship of those objects to that larger fish, rather than focusing on that one single solitary large fish thing, right? So, so collectivist cultures and individualist cultures are going to interpret situations very differently. Their perception of the scene is entirely different, for example. So it's no wonder then that that we have these big differences in behavior across cultures, yeah?
That reminds me of something I saw recently. It was about bike safety, but it shows these two teams, one's in white jumpers, one's in black, and it asked how many times does the white team pass the ball, and they're passing a ball back and forth, and I was paying attention, trying to see how
Well, do you want me to show it?
Oh, you've seen it?
I'll show it. Have you seen this? Anybody? Okay. I'll show it to you. So this is a little video clip, and it'll ask you to engage in a particular task. And just follow the instructions.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13.
How many got it? Most everybody. Yeah.
Did you see the moonwalking bear?
I didn't even see it the second time.
So this is an example of a phenomenon that psychologists refer to as selective attention. You basically have a limited amount of cognitive capacity to. Hey, exit full screen. Okay. You have a limited amount of cognitive capacity with which to process visual information. And so if your focus is directed in one area, it's very easy to miss something that seems very obvious if you're cued into it that's there. And so let that be a lesson. Those of you who try to talk on your cell phones and drive, humans aren't built that way. Okay. Yeah, so what's that? It's not about visual pathways versus other kinds of pathways. It's about cognitive capacity and the ability to split attention between, for example, a conversation and focusing on a conversation and all of the complex array of stimuli that are in your driving environment. You know, we take it for granted. You know, you get in your car, you jump in your car, you drive around, and you take for granted exactly how complex and really bewildering, really, that is, because once you become accustomed to it, you start tuning out things that you don't need to pay attention to, right? So it's generally the research shows that it doesn't depend on a particular pathway, but it has more global cognitive effects in terms of selective attention. Yeah, did you have a?
I was going to say that's why most of the accidents ensue.
Sure, yeah.
Or you just get somewhere you don't really know that you went past it. You know that it's there, but you didn't remember going past
Yeah,
the building
yeah,
that time.
yeah. So if I were a dispositionalist and I played that first clip for you and you didn't see the moonwalking bear, I could say, oh, you're a bunch of lazy slobs for not noticing the bear. But really, it's the power of the situation and affecting your ability to collect all that information and to process it effectively, right? Yeah.
Would that have a different outcome if they didn't say how many passes, if they just had you just watch it?
Yeah.
Do you think people would
Yeah. You have to make yourself cognitively busy in order to cause that selective attention deficit. Yeah. Okay, so here's a couple of individual difference variables that are kind of interesting. This is among hundreds or thousands of individual differences that we can measure. One of them is known as locus of control. And so locus, you know, the root here having to do with location or place, where you see control in your life. Individuals with an internal locus of control tend to see the outcomes of situations as very controllable by them, whereas people with an external locus of control will see situations as being under less individual control by them and more subject to external factors, right? So if I'm high on internal locus of control, then I might tend to attribute my good exam grade to my hard work, whereas if I have a high external locus of control, I might attribute my high exam grade to the fact that the teacher made the test too easy, right? And vice versa, if I have a high internal locus of control, a high external locus of control, and I get a bad exam score, then I might say, well, the teacher just made it too hard. If I have a high internal locus of control and I get a bad exam score, I won't feel very good about myself, right? And then what's going to happen is there's going to be another factor that's going to come to play here, which is self-serving bias, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so another one that I like to talk about is optimism. People differ in optimism, not necessarily so much in how broadly optimistic or pessimistic they are, but what's more interesting is a couple of types of optimism. psychologists can measure the degree to which that someone has a high level of realistic optimism or a high level of unrealistic optimism. And here's what happens. People with a high realistic level of optimism tend to not take as many risks as people with high levels of unrealistic optimism. So when we look, for example, in experiments on undergraduates, those that are sexually active, high levels of unrealistic optimism is correlated with unsafe sex practices or sex practices that particularly have to do with not using effective contraceptive methods. And when we ask people why they didn't use effective contraception, what they'll generally tell us is they just feel they don't feel very vulnerable to negative outcomes in situations, if you consider that negative. But, so then you might say, well, why have this unrealistic optimism? What use would it be? Well, it turns out that those individuals who have high levels of unrealistic optimism also have high levels of self-esteem. And so it may be that partly that unrealistic optimism helps them feel better about themselves, even though they're in these situations where they're creating risky behaviors, perhaps. And it's important to feel good about yourself.
So where would pessimism fit into this scenario? I mean, like,
I don't.
as opposed to people who do not have high levels of optimism at all, or I mean.
Yeah, I don't think that sort of what you might call pessimistic people I don't think they're just part of that study. I don't know if pessimism is studied.
Optimism as
That's an interesting point. So here's something interesting about depression, clinical depression, major depressive disorder. People who have a major depressive disorder tend to have a more accurate appraisal of their life circumstances than people who don't have a depressive disorder. It is sad, yeah. But here you go. Maybe part of that unrealistic optimism is ignoring the things that would bring you down, right? Right? So optimism as in itself may be a buffering effect against, I don't know, anybody know where this quote comes from? It's it must be one of the existentialists, but I don't know. The quote is, men, something about men living in states of quiet desperation. Is that Emerson or? No, he's a transcendentalist, wasn't he? Yeah, I don't know. So anyway, so this idea that, the world is really a tough place to be. And it's not always a really pleasant place to be. Think about now in our current situation where we've got a planet that's heating up, we've got wars, active genocides going on in the world. Our economy is going down the tubes. It would be really easy to sink into, a state of desperation. But maybe this optimism helps buffer from that realism. Yeah.
It reminded me of a comment. A friend of mine, she was overly pessimistic, and I asked her why, and her response was because if you're optimistic, you have room to be disappointed all the time. Whereas with her pessimism, she was constantly pleasantly surprised when people exceeded her expectations.
So pessimism as a defense against disappointment. Interesting. Yep. I was trying to think of a Freudian defense mechanism that would match that, but I can't. So you know how I like comics. This is this is perhaps a good illustration of unrealistic optimism. I've tried to take my cat on a walk, and it's not pleasant. Hey, you know what they got now, though? Cat strollers. You can take them out like they're like a baby. Yeah. I'll try to find a picture of it and put one up here. Yeah. Well, they're zippered in. They have a little mesh enclosure. Yeah. And they got like food and water in there if you want to take them for a long walk. Yeah. Crazy, huh? All right. So, use a stroller. Don't use a leash. Leashes don't work. Okay, so now I'm starting to make a bit of a bridge from personality psychology to social psychology. Oftentimes in academic programs, like in graduate schools, you'll see personality and social psychology in the same area together. And that's because the more that we study personality, the more that we study the situation and the power of each of them, we see how complex the relationship is between personality and situation in terms of determining behavior. So this comes under the broad category of what's called social cognition. So how we think about ourselves and how we think about other people. One of the biases we have, you remember when we talked about cognition and we talked about biases, which are like filters. They help us, they're filters through which we see the world and filter out information that we don't want to pay attention to. And one of the biases we have in person perception is called the self-serving bias. And so here's how the self-serving bias works. Basically, we like to feel good about ourselves. We like to maintain a high level of self-esteem. And so the self-serving bias allows us to do this when we succeed, but more importantly, it allows us to do this when we fail. And what happens is when we succeed at something, when we're successful at something, we attribute that success, attribution, that's an attributed characteristic, we attribute that success to our disposition, our personality, that we're a good person. We succeeded because we're good. When we fail, what we will do oftentimes is attribute that failure to the situation. I failed the exam because it was a cloudy day and I'm in a bad mood on a cloudy day, right? The thing is that this not only works for individuals, but it works for groups. So our in-groups, people who are more like us, we will tend to attribute their success to their disposition. So the Red Sox beat the Tampa Bay Marlins in baseball, and they did that because the Red Sox are a good team and they have good team cohesion and good coaching, right? But at the beginning of the season, the Red Sox got beat by Toronto. They got swept in 3 games. And I think the Red Sox lost because it was just the beginning of the season, and they're not used to playing in these dome, these big dome things. They like playing outside, right? So the situation allows me to explain the failure and not have it fall on the self, on who I am as a person, right? Now, here's what happens with other individuals and other groups. we not only explain our successes to our disposition, but we will explain other people's successes as a result of the situation, and other people's failure as a result of their disposition, right? So the Yankees beat the Red Sox because, they got lucky that day. But the Red Sox won because they're a better team. They beat the Yankees. And so here's kind of how it looks if you graph it out. Based on who is winning or failing, the attribution falls on disposition or situation. So when we succeed, we tend to attribute it to our disposition. When they succeed, we attribute it to the situation, right? And this is all tied into something broadly known as just world beliefs. Just world beliefs is the idea that good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. See? We are good people, right? They are bad people. So in this way, it allows me to always kind of feel good about myself. It's a good thing. Except that, a lot of the time we're lying to ourselves when we do this, right? We really failed because we didn't study for that exam. It wasn't because the teacher made it too hard. But sometimes we need to maintain that self-esteem. We need to bolster that self-esteem. Yeah, this is, when we look at this stuff, we're looking at normal individuals. And when we start talking about depression, that can have effects on attribution. One of the things that's very common among individuals with chronic depression or major depressive disorder is the idea that they are very dichotomous. They tend to see things in extremes, in black or white, and very little sort of in the middle. And so when I fail, I don't just make a mistake. I fail, right? So it's just, part of it is probably that shifting of the perception from moderate to extreme. But I'm not sure, yeah.
One of the things that this makes me think of, the
self-efficacy, yeah.
efficacy is like systems of divination and things like that, like birth signs.
Yes.
Like, I failed the test because there was a high Taurus rising and that cuts off my positive energy from Mercury.
Partly, yeah. But it's also the hindsight bias. Did your book talk about that yet? No, that'll be in the next chapter. The hindsight bias is, basically, they say hindsight is 20/20. Yeah, we tend to, when we look back on situations, we tend to pay more attention to areas where we were correct, right? And so if I had gotten this horoscope and I failed the test, we look back on that and say, oh, of course, I could have predicted that at the time, right? But yeah, self-efficacy is gonna be impacted by, and that someone who believes in, I don't know what the correlation is between believing in horoscopes or divination and external locus of control. It might be that there's a high correlation between those two, but I don't know for sure. It seems logical, but I've never seen the data, so I don't know. There's going to be lots of variation. Yep. one of the things that we will do sometimes is we will let me think about how this works. I can't, I'll talk about it next time. I have to refresh my memory on it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about culture, so self, situation, culture. And when we look at individualist cultures, and remember that this is on a continuum. So you've got a continuum from individualist to collectivist. And over here somewhere is the USA, and just a little bit further along the continuum to collectivist, you've got Canada. And then out here somewhere is the poster boy for collectivist cultures, which is Japan. And a little bit more individualist is Korea, and then China, right? So East Asian versus North American is how we typically break out collectivist and individualist cultures. And when we look at individualist cultures, what we tend to see is a strong emphasis on personal freedoms, and people tend to take a great deal of pride in their accomplishment, right? In collectivist cultures, what we tend to see is the freedoms are not so much individual or personal, but rather they're tied to your family and your status. So in this way, we see individuals and their behavior in a very different light. People can behave in very individual ways here. People are going to be expected to behave in very family or status relevant ways, right? And when we look at accomplishment, what we tend to see in collectivist cultures is instead of taking pride in something they do well, their successes, what they will tend to do is demonstrate humility, basically being humble or modest, right? Yes, I succeeded, but my success, of course, is due not only to me and my effort, but the support of my family and my teammates and things like that, right? Or anybody could have done well in this situation. I just happened to do well, yeah.
Where do my cousin moved to New York, and she has this really good friend, and her family's like really, socially high class, rich, and they're very focused on like, you must do what the family, and the family is your whole family, but they're very, very prideful, and humility isn't something
Yeah.
they would really engage in. And so where do families like that fall?
Yeah. What's the ethnicity or cultural heritage, do you know? European American? Yeah. Okay. Here's one of the things that it really depends a lot on family relationships depend a lot on ethnicity and culture. And so I suspect they're not, do they look?
They came from London.
What's that?
Oh, they came from London.
Okay. It's just, it may be some individual differences there. In British systems, and don't forget, Europe is over here somewhere. They're more collectivist than Canada. And so in the British system, for example, especially status, cultural, your status within the society has a lot to do with what you do and what's expected and that kind of thing. Whereas in the United States, there's less of an influence on that, but it still does have an influence. So I think that may be where that's coming from. And the idea that family heritage and family history is a source of pride. Whereas in the United States, we're all a bunch of mongrel immigrants here, right? And so there's less of that kind of characteristic. But I'm not sure about that. Yeah. Yep.
So what about somebody who, my boyfriend is Albanian, and he was a refugee. He was, 16 years old, and they were rescued. And his culture is very, very family oriented, and it's more collectivist. But what about they've raised half their life there, and then they move and then finish the rest of it here? What happens then?
Good question. Here's what happens. And this is data from. Well, let me do one more thing, and I'll talk about that. So self-esteem, as we said, is one of those things that we generally think of as being a good thing. And so if we think of North American individuals versus Japanese individuals, one might tend to predict that Japanese individuals have lower self-esteem because they tend to be more humble, right? They tend to be more self-effacing, more modest, tend to attribute successes to, other people in their environment as well as themselves. But it turns out that that's not the case. And here's how this works out. Your self-esteem has to do with you feeling good. I am a good person. But the thing is that good in North American culture is very different than good in Japanese culture. In North America, we consider being good as having a high sense of self-regard and telling people that. I'm doing a great job teaching my class using psychophysiology laboratory exercises, right? I didn't mind going to the public relations office and saying, hey, look at me, write a newspaper article about me, right? But in Japan, when we look at what self-esteem means, being good is very different. Being good means having sort of a self-critical attitude or a humble attitude toward the self, and telling other people that you have a self-critical attitude. So can you imagine, somebody from Japan coming here and saying all these self-critical things about themselves, and you go, I think you need to go to a counselor and work on your self-esteem, right? No. So this is research done by Steve Heine, and I worked with Steve at the University of British Columbia. And he looked at see if I can draw this graph for you. He looked at self-esteem among Japanese individuals. And what he found was that native Japanese displayed, in terms of self-esteem scales that we would use in North America, if we just translate those to Japanese, they score relatively low compared to native Canadians, who would score up here somewhere, or actually, they score a little lower. They're down here. And here's what happens. Japanese who have traveled outside of Japan, maybe just, for visits, Japanese who emigrate, I guess the word is, right? Japanese who emigrate to Canada and haven't lived in Canada very long will score a little bit higher. This is second generation. Second generation Canadians shoot way up. Born in Canada, but Japanese culture. And then, interestingly, actually, these wind up a little higher than native Canadians. So, exposure to North American culture changes the conception of the Japanese individuals in terms of self-esteem, what self-esteem means, what being good means, right? So, so yeah, culture, does have an effect even if you're not living in it. Yeah.
Would it be true to say then there's big differences in individual differences in this concept then, even in people from the same culture?
Oh, yes.
So the way they express themselves, to other people would not be necessarily across the board meaning the same.
Yep. There's always more differences within groups than there are between groups, typically. Yeah. Yeah. There's more differences within sex or gender in behavior than there is between men and women. There's more variance within women or within men than there is between men and women. So, yeah, we typically get those kinds of results. Yeah. Okay, so how is it then? What kinds of factors will have an effect on behavior? In intro psych, one of the things you saw, hopefully, was the Bobo the doll experiment. Did I show you that clip? Yeah. Those of you who weren't in the class, maybe you didn't see it. But here's essentially what Bandura did. He took children and exposed them to, showed them an adult who was modeling violent behavior toward this inflatable doll that was called a Bobo doll. And you would knock it down and it would pop back up. And when the adults modeled violent behavior toward the doll, children who watched that were much more likely to engage in aggressive and violent behavior with the doll, and were more likely to use new ways of being aggressive toward the doll than were children who watched an adult play non-aggressively with the doll. So, so the situation has an effect just in the aspect that when we observe other people around us, that provides a cue for us to change our behavior or in what way that our behavior would be appropriate or inappropriate. Also, cognitive demands. So the selective attention test that I gave you was a good example of the idea that when you're cognitively busy doing one thing, it's hard to do other things at the same time. And what will happen is if your environment is very, if the situation is very stimulating and you need to pay attention to a lot of things all at once, your ability to think and make decisions is going to be impaired. And so then you're going to use cognitive shortcuts to make those decisions, like heuristics, and we'll talk about those in the next couple classes. We know that crowding has a big effect on behavior. Both crowding and heat increase aggression. Okay. And over the next couple of classes, we'll be talking about a couple of different aspects of social behavior. One is called bystander apathy. And bystander apathy happens when someone here's what happens. In a situation where you are among a lot of people, when there's a lot of people around, you're less likely to be helped if you have an emergency than when there's just one or two people, which seems very counterintuitive. And also, another thing that plays into bystander apathy and is a huge influence of the situation on behavior is conformity, the idea that we tend to conform to the behaviors of individuals around us. And then also obedience, which is the idea that we tend to look toward authority figures for cues about how to behave. So we're always looking out there in our social environment trying to figure out what's the right thing to do, to a large part based on what other people are doing. We're very social animals in that way. Let me show you, yeah.
Conformity is you basically behave in the same way as somebody who's
Either the same way as the authority figure, or you take directions from the authority figure. Yeah, and we'll look at at a couple of experiments in that regard. Let me show you a little, just before we go there. Let me show you a little video clip that'll demonstrate the power of the bystander apathy effect.
Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill. How long before he gets help? Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule we ought to help, and the other is the rule we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help. And it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
People don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You alright? You alright?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit sleepy, you know what I mean?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
You wanna sit up? You alright, yeah? Strong.
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
6 seconds. He even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
Why you're lying on the floor in the rain?
Because he's part of the right group. Everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill, that nobody helping him walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay. And I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he would ruin the suit anyway.
So I like that clip. It really illustrates strongly how powerful other people are in determining what kinds of behavior we'll engage in. And most of these people probably, most of these people looking at and saying, why didn't these other people help? They probably made dispositional attributions. Oh, well, they didn't want to get involved, or they were busy, right? As opposed to the power of the situation on behavior. Yeah, a question.
Is it just with strangers, or is it even within, because that happened to me personally in an office where I knew everybody, I laughed and conversed with everybody, and I passed out on my desk. I think they thought I might have been sleeping. I don't know.
Yeah.
But finally, one of the office women just happened to come over and just do something, and all of a sudden, everyone was calling 911. Everyone was
Yeah.
doing it, but is it typical?
Yeah. Here's what happens.
People that you know personally, like intimate. If we're talking small office space.
Yeah. In order to help, one of the things people have to do immediately is interpret it as an emergency. So if they interpreted it as she's sleeping, or if they interpreted it as, oh, he's drunk, that makes a big difference in terms of helping behavior. So if you're in a situation where, if you're in this situation and you're able to talk, you need to communicate very clearly that this is an emergency and you need help. Yeah. I mean, the first guy was saying, yeah, help me, right? So that's, those people definitely had to have interpreted it as an emergency, or maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say something along those lines, like, these people may think that they're going to be harmed by this person. I mean, I think it's just goes back to what we were talking about, months ago, that we're too afraid of, like, because of, or maybe it's just like, exercises, but we're afraid because of, like, TV or whatever, then things are more dangerous than they are. Like, we could perceive this person as, like the woman just, laying down, like, she could just be asleep. She's not, if I were to fall, sit down on a nice day, I might fall asleep.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't, unless I saw a person, like, bleeding or something like that, or if,
Actually, blood acts as a severe inhibitor for helping behavior.
Exactly what if they put some red on it. I was thinking that for sure people would.
No, actually, then they start having fears of contamination.
Yeah, like if some guy's like passed out, depending it makes sense that if he's in a business suit, of course they can help while I'm there. But in a busy street corner, you see homeless people all the time. You see people on drugs all the time. Like,
So.
Just be one of those cases. I think we're just like stereotyping what is out there.
So on a busy street corner, you see people that are homeless. And so the people that pass by these people, are they callous people? Probably not. For the most part, they're not. They're probably, for the most part, quite compassionate people. But what happens when everybody else is passing by? That's the power of conformity in the situation, right? And when one person stops to help, then it creates the opportunity for other people to start joining that conforming group, right? So we're very, we have very strong conformity pressures in our lives, and it's so invisible, it's hard to see it when it's not brought to your attention in clear detail. Did you have a question, Laura? So if your dad stops because he's a firefighter, is that because he's stopping because of his personality, or because that's his role? That's his social role. This woman who stopped may have been exceptional in some way, this isn't obviously a controlled experiment where we've got lots of subjects and things. So it may have been an anomaly, but typically that kind of situation, if someone is an expert, oftentimes they will step up more quickly than other people. But yeah. Hold on a second. Yeah.
Collectivist societies
Oh, that's a good question. So if you run conformity study, yes, actually collectivist cultures exhibit higher levels of conformity than do individualist cultures.
Say even in the same situation, because it seems like by pride of like being with each other, they would be more apt to go help.
Right. That's a good question. I don't know if something like if they've done something like this in collectivist cultures, but I think the conformity pressures to not act would actually be quite high. Plus, you've got the what do they call them? The briefcase men, or you know what I'm talking about? Salarymen, yeah, in Japan. And so these are people who, you want to say what salarymen are? They're people who basically office workers, and they work so hard that they're exhausted when they go home, and sometimes they'll just fall asleep on the subway, and they'll be riding the subway all night long with their briefcase. And, they'll wake up in their suits and go to work the next day, right? And so maybe, in those kinds of cultures, that's normal to see someone passed out on a subway. I don't know, yeah.
I was just going to ask the culture.
So, yeah, so normality within cultures is probably going to have an influence too, yeah. Okay, yeah, before we take off today.
I was also wondering if maybe, besides just culture, like area, like in an urban area where there's so many people, you kind of get like a whole rat race thing going where you try to not see everyone because it would drive you crazy.
Yes.
Whereas if you're in a rural setting,
yes.
it seems like you might be more apt to pay attention to the individual.
Yes, yes. Again, essentially the size of the crowd is diminished in rural areas. Yeah, it does work differently in rural areas. Yeah. Yeah, and they tend to, rural residents tend to have more of an interdependent kind of existence too. So, all right. So I'll see you all next week, huh? Thursday.
Pray for good weather, right?
Yeah, pray for good weather.